Hello everyone, and in this part of the video we're going to be going over some changes that have been made since the initial recordings that I made of these videos. Specifically, we've added a few more functions to the interfaces. The horse/vehicle interface has a few additional functions to help you out. There's also a new function for detecting if the character is sitting in the seat versus if they are actually mounted on the seat. Now, this was actually part of the component, but was not exposed to an interface. Now the interface directly has that function, and you can call that in the animation blueprint. All right, so with that in mind, one of the first things we're going to do is change one of the initial interface functions that we had on the horse. So go over here and open up the horse. And under Perform Dismount, we're going to change this Perform Dismount function to return true. The reason we do this is this function is now called during the dismount as a way to prepare your horse for dismounting. If you have any kind of custom variables that need to be set, or like the vehicle needs to be turned off or something along those lines, this is where you would do that. So we're going to save that. So now this returning true is required for the dismounting system to function properly. Okay, so with that out of the way, everything else here should be as normal. I'm going to go to the IMountablePawn, and there's going to be a few new functions here. Okay, so one of the first functions that we're going to look at, besides this one, is the set seat occupied by ID. Now, like all of the functions for the interfaces that I create, I also make an analog within the appropriate component. So all you have to do is drag this out and say set seat occupied by ID. And all you have to do is connect the dots. So basically what this function allows you to do is set a seat occupied at a specific identifier. And it also has another function called set seat occupied at index, which does the same thing. Now, the difference is when we look at our seat manager here, each seat has a seat ID, but they're all stored in an array. So set seat by ID will find the seat with the given unique ID, make sure they're unique, and it will set that. Otherwise, it's just going to come across the first seat ID that you give it, and it's going to set that. So make sure the seat IDs are all unique, and that way that function will work for each individual seat. Set seat occupied at index does the same thing, but it uses the seat index in the array. So same thing as by ID, we're going to pull this out and do set seat occupied by index. And this just gives you a few additional options. For the most part, you probably won't need it, but if you do need it, then it is there. We're done with set seat by index and set seat by ID. The next one is for querying whether a seat is occupied on the mount. So is seat occupied by ID? You give it the seat ID, and it looks to see if that seat by the given ID is occupied by an actor. As you can see, I always have an analog for the actual components, so you just connect the dots. Now we go to occupied at index and do the same thing. All right. So now that we have is seat occupied by ID and is seat occupied by index done, we're going to go to a new function that you'll probably find incredibly useful called IMountablePawn. The sole purpose of this function is within your interaction system to determine if this particular vehicle or horse or animal or what have you can be mounted by the specified pawn that is sent in. So your character walks up to a vehicle. This asks the question, does he have the key? Does she have security access? Is the animal tamed, and does it belong to this character who's trying to mount it and use it as a mount? This is where that kind of logic will be. Right now, I don't have anything because it's very game specific. So I'm just going to say yes, no matter who you are or what you are, you can mount this character. You can mount this horse. There's not going to be any logic to stop you. Get seat data by ID. This is a very useful function, especially if you need to save things or load things. But basically what it does is it gets the current data, it gets the data of this seat. So it'll return this entire seat to you. So I'll close this one. This whole structure here will be at your access. So we'll return a copy of that to you if you need it for whatever reason. Maybe you're looking to see, is there a mounting position on the right? Is there a mounting position on the left? Above it, below it, whatever. What the seat socket name is. Is it currently occupied? Things like that. That's what this function is for. Again, out of the box, you probably won't need it, but if you're writing any kind of custom logic, it might be useful. So there's always, like I said, there's always an analog, mountable pawn component. Pull that out. Get seat data by ID. We plug these in and plug that in. So now we go to get seat data at index. Behaves the same way, except it gets the seat at the specified index. Mountable pawn. Get seat data at index. Connect the dots. Compile and save. Get mountable pawn component. This is a utility function that almost all of the interfaces now have. It basically allows you to get the appropriate component if you need some other functionality that isn't specified within the interface itself. Now, there aren't a whole lot of those, but just in case, maybe you've created a custom mountable pawn component derived from my mountable pawn component, or something along those lines, then this is how you can get that. Clear seat by index. Now, in the older version of this, there was a clear seat by ID somewhere in here, right here, but there was no clear seat by index. That was before I made the wise decision to provide both of these functions. So, just like before, clear seat by index. Connect the dots, compile, and save. Okay, that is it for the updates to the horse. Now let's take a look at the other classes. Okay, so now let's go to the player controller. And we're going to hook up a new function in the controller interface. Interfaces, mounting. By the way, at the release of this game, these interface names may have changed and become a little more simplified, so keep an eye out for that. It might just be interfaces that you're clicking. Just be aware. So I'm going to expand this, and there's a new function, getWriter controller component, which I'm already looking at. Same thing as the horse function of getMountablePawn component. This returns the rider controller component. I'm just going to move that down, compile, and save. All right, so now let's take a look at the mounting character. So never mind this. I'm just going to delete that. That was me testing things. This should work fine. Expand interfaces, mounting interfaces. And you can see I have, like I was talking about before, I've already simplified the IMountRider interface to follow what I was talking about before. So do note that in the future, you probably won't have this additional extra step here. So let's go to the getMountRider component. And same as the last, you can grab the MountRider component and return it. And save. Okay. Now here's one of the new functions that I was talking about. Is seated on mount. This is pretty handy because basically what this allows you to do is determine whether your character is actually sitting on the mount. The isMounted variable that we use in the animation blueprints gets set almost immediately, so that puts him in this kind of I'm mounted but not mounted series yet. And then we trigger off the animontages that actually start the mounting and dismounting. What this does is basically this is not set until the whole mounting process is finished and your character's butt is sitting on the mount or in the seat. Now this variable has actually been here since the start and inception of this whole system. I just didn't have it exposed to a blueprint, to a interface. So MountRider component is seated is the variable. And we're going to hook that up. Now what you could do is you could have used the getMountRider component function, interface function, to just get this and then get the seated, but I like making things simple for people. So that is why there is a straight interface function is seated on mount. getRiderMesh. This one's going to become useful later, but for right now, we're just going to grab this and stick that there. This is important because there are certain things that have to be done to the mesh in order to get it to sit properly. And this function basically allows the system to grab that mesh and manipulate it without having to cast to a character or a pawn in order to get the mesh. We can just use the interface for that. All right, so you may have noticed this getDebugID. This is really just for debugging the mounting system. It's custom, it's whatever you want it to be. I have it set up a certain way. You can view it the same way, but basically it allows me to determine what world I'm looking in whenever I'm debugging these systems and what functions have fired off for that world and what rider. It's a little complicated, but if you want to look at that code, go ahead. I'm not going to get too much into it. You can actually leave this unconnected if you want. Compile and save. All right, and that's it for some of the changes that I needed to make and show you, and I hope, as usual, this is extremely helpful. Thank you, and see you next time.